Okay, so I had an issue, had to restart, so I guess there'll be two separate videos. But yeah, so these groups were created under apartheid, partially because they wanted to pit the people who were mixed race, who they labeled as colored, against black Africans. So they created a situation where if you were mixed race, and they determined this, and looking at skin color, looking at how curly your hair was, they would put a pencil in your hair, and if it fell out, then you're colored. If it stayed in, you're black, right? But they created this situation where they're like, okay, if you're colored, we're going to give you a little bit more than if you're black African. And so they kind of tried to create these divisions so people wouldn't come together to overthrow the apartheid government. So they speak different languages, because they were isolated. They said, you have to live in this neighborhood, you live in this neighborhood. People who are colored, to this day, still tend to speak Afrikaans. People who are black African tend to speak Xhosa or Zulu. Those are Bantu languages, so they have to do a tribal affiliation, right? So that was meaningful there, whereas if you were labeled colored or identified as colored in South Africa, you would come over here and we would see you as black, right? Trevor Noah would be considered colored, but here he's considered black, right? So you can see how what's meaningful in one cultural context is different in another. And so these categories are shaped by historical processes like apartheid and what was or is meaningful. Ethnicity is different. This is statuses based on cultural heritage and shared feelings of peoplehood. So we would emphasize customs and lifestyles here, and we decide how important it is to us. So a good example of this is, technically, I have German heritage. My great-grandmother, her parents were from Germany, right? I don't identify as German American. I could, but I don't. And one of the reasons I don't is that no one in my family that I know speaks German. I don't have any family stories about German culture. Don't eat German food. I mean, if I have no aspects of German culture, just that heritage. Someone else could have the same amount of German heritage, but maybe their family was really invested in it, and they learned German, and they eat German food, and they sing German songs, or whatever, right? So ethnicity is that sort of, it's a little more voluntary, it's a little more optional, right? Another way of looking at that would be, a lot of people have Irish heritage in the U.S. They might be more invested in their Irish heritage around St. Patrick's Day than other times of the year, or some people might be really invested in it and other people aren't. It's about culture, right? And the video kind of talks about this guy who thought he was German, took a DNA test, found out that he was Scottish, so he traded his lederhosen in for a kilt. So what does that mean? Why is that meaningful? Did taking that DNA test change how other people treated him? No. But it changed how he thought about himself. That's ethnicity. So race versus ethnicity, and this is, I think, kind of an oversimplification, but this is how we generally talk about race and ethnicity as sociologists. Race is externally imposed. You don't get to choose your race, right? It's how other people label you. Ethnicity is self-defined, right? I get to decide based on my German heritage, whether it's something I identify with or not. Similarly, race is involuntary, ethnicity is voluntary, right? You can't really change your race, but you can say, part of my ethnicity, maybe it's not important to me, I don't need to deal with it. I don't identify that way. Race tends to be based on physical differences, ethnicity tends to be based on cultural differences. Why do I think this is complicated? Well, because by this definition, and actually, you know what, let me continue. Race is exclusive, right? Okay. President Obama is just as white as he is black, but the way we label him, his race, we tend to talk about him as being black, because we race tends to be there's one category that is more important. Ethnicity is fluid and multiple. I'm German, I'm Jewish, I'm English, I'm Irish, I'm Eastern European, a lot of different categories, right? You can be all those things at once. So why is this complicated? Well, this thing about race being unequal and ethnicity being non-hierarchical, okay? So if you think about how Jews were treated. Judaism is both an ethnicity and a religion, not a race, right? It's not based on physical differences, things like that, right? It's cultural. Yet, you can imagine a situation where people are, because of their heritage, because of their cultural differences, treated in an unequal way, right? Where people might not get to say, I identify as Jewish or not. With the Nazis, if you had a Jewish grandparent, you were considered Jewish, even if you converted, right? So ethnicity is not always self-defined. It's not always voluntary. Right? But this is kind of how we talk about these things. So Hispanic Latino, is it a race or ethnicity? Well, the census says, and the current federal policy is, it's an ethnicity. Right? It's complicated, though. One of the reasons it's complicated is you can imagine a situation where somebody doesn't identify as Hispanic or Latino. It's not an important part of their lives. They don't speak Spanish, or they don't eat food from that culture or anything like that, and yet other people would label them that way because of how they look. All right? Easily, you can imagine a situation like that. Then when you ask people who are Hispanic or Latino, 11% say Hispanic is their race. Just to remind you the difference between Hispanic and Latino. Hispanic would be from a Spanish-speaking country. Latino is from Latin America. So there are Latin American countries don't speak Spanish, like Brazil. So, and there are Hispanic countries that are not in Latin America, so like Spain. So they're not interchangeable. All right. 56% of Hispanic adults say it's their race and their ethnicity. 19% say it's just their ethnicity, and 13% don't know how to categorize it. And you get people who might identify as Hispanic or Latino in certain contexts and not others. I had a friend in grad school, and she is mixed race, or mixed ethnicity, I guess you'd say. Her mom is white, her dad was from Mexico, and she said, I identify as Latino when I'm asked on kind of a survey for something, because I am, but when someone asks me, I might not say I am because I don't speak Spanish, so other people might not accept me as Latino, right? So it's complicated, and these things are complicated. So you might be wondering about DNA tests and race, because it's becoming more and more common for people to, or popular for people to take DNA tests, and then they say things like, I'm 5% Irish, or I'm, 50% Italian, or whatever. So a reasonable question might be, if race is a social construct, then what are DNA tests measuring? How is it able to tell me those things? Well, the way DNA tests work is these companies have taken DNA samples from what they would refer to as reference populations. So they've gone to France, to people who say their ancestors have lived in France for a long time. They know their genealogy. They take their DNA. And they take their DNA from a lot of different people. And then they'll take your DNA and they'll compare it to the DNA from those reference populations, see how closely related you are to them. And if you're closely related to these people who say that their ancestors are from France, then that means you're probably French, right? Because if you're related to them, then you probably have a family member who is French. So this is complicated because of historical migration. How do you really know people's ancestors were in France for so long? I mean, people have migrated all over, not just, now. People have been migrating for thousands of years. How do we divide geographic areas? Remember when we were talking about the division of Africa, right? These country lines were more or less random. They didn't encompass, actual populations that would have considered themselves genetically distinct or culturally distinct. Also, lack of a global DNA database, so you're basing on maybe limited reference populations. So when is DNA meaningful? When is it not? I mean, that's a good question. So think about the Elizabeth Warren situation. So she identified as part Native American from family stories. And there's a lot of criticism about that, right? So she said, you take a DNA test and it'll tell me the truth, right? So she took a DNA test and she did have some Native American ancestry. But is that meaningful? Right? First off, it was a small amount, but second off, did that change the fact that she didn't have any tribal affiliation? The fact that she was not part of any kind of Native American community? That she didn't have Native American experiences growing up? Didn't grow up on a reservation? Of course, you don't have to grow up on a reservation, but she didn't even, know any Native Americans growing up. Did it change the fact that she appears white? That people, she was never treated differently because she had the Native American ancestry? Not really, right? And so there was a lot of pushback from people who are Native saying, hey, that amount of DNA doesn't really matter to us, right? That doesn't change anything. In the same way that if you took a DNA test and said you were 2% Jewish, you couldn't start going to a synagogue and saying, I'm Jewish, right? Because you don't have the cultural practices. People would say, no, you have to convert if you want to be Jewish, right? In the same way that if I took a DNA test and said I was 5% black, I couldn't say, yeah, I'm black now, right? Because I'm not, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you have that heritage. It matters how society views you, right? So DNA is sometimes meaningful, it's sometimes not meaningful. In the video, it kind of gives you an interesting idea of how do people react when they get their DNA tested and they find out different things about themselves. So I would challenge you to think about what would be meaningful to you. If you, how would you react if you took a DNA test and you found out that you weren't the race or ethnicity that you identify as, or that other people have identified you as? Would it change how you're treated in society? Would it change how you view yourself? And kind of thinking about how this is really complicated. There's a lot going on here. And, so on Wednesday, we're going to be going over where these racial categories come from. What's the history behind all of this? And what does it mean for society? So hopefully this worked for everybody and was helpful. I will record hopefully the same way on Wednesday and Friday.